want to talk about your ability to manage these vulnerabilities. How do you go about identifying, remediating, and tracking the security of your network from this standpoint? And there's a few tips that we can give you to really, increase the effectiveness of this program. The very first thing you want to do is, well, have a program. We want to establish a formal management program that will do things like track assignments, track completion levels, and give us a good rundown of what our risk actually looks like. We also need to maintain an inventory of the assets that we actually have. That way, if we do come up with something that is unknown to us or is coming in as a critical vulnerability, we know exactly where it sits and what the interplay is between that system and the rest of our network. If there's a server that we have to take offline for patching or something along those lines, we could inadvertently end up taking down a big chunk of our network or impacting our ability to work for a day-to-day basis, just based on the fact that we didn't know what the interplay between those devices was. We see it fairly frequently. We also want to make sure that, again, we're scanning regularly, pretty much continuously if we possibly can. We want to make sure we're prioritizing based on the risk level, so taking care of our criticals, our highs as the first and foremost actions that we have, and then moving on to the lower or informational vulnerabilities as we go through. And then we want to make sure we can patch very, very quickly. There's automation tools that can help you out with this as well. You also have to decide if you want to be kind of the canary in the coal mine for this new software patch that's coming out. Do you want to be the early adopter, or do you want to sit back and wait, see if it breaks things, and then make your decision based on that? We also want to make sure that you're planning ahead of time for your zero-day vulnerabilities in your incident response plan. And this is a question that we get very, very frequently. How do we go about doing this? Make sure that you're including vulnerability response in your IR plans, especially for unknowns or 0 days. Make sure that you're practicing. So run things like tabletop exercises. Ensure that your IT staff and your responders are up to date on what they should be doing if something like this pops up, and just make sure your roles and responsibilities are clear. IBM's cost of a data breach report estimates that you can save yourself up to $2.6 million off the cost of a data breach if you test and regularly update your incident response plan. So good tangible benefit for running those kinds of exercises. So let's go into defense here to wrap up. When we're talking about defensive strategies for stopping something like what you just saw from happening, where do you actually end up starting? And there's a few things you can do to get yourself off to a good start. One of them is basically going to be to understand what your network looks like. We've been talking about this for a little while now. We want to understand our internal subnets. We want to know what kind of VLANs we have available. We want to know where our access points are. And we want to know what's going to connect externally from the network out to the big bad public internet. We also want to make sure we understand where our data is. So we want to know where our on-premise data is stored and the condition it's in. Is it encrypted? We want to know our cloud data, encryption status, and a lot more. This comes down to just maintaining an accurate asset and data inventory, which can be difficult, but there are tools out there that can really help you. The big advice we have here is to remember the cloud is potentially part of your attack surface, so make sure you're including network, cloud, and software as a service applications in these scans. We also want to make sure we're keeping track of which assets are the most vulnerable on the system. And again, this is coming out of the Tenable dashboard. This is telling us that we have a high count of vulnerabilities on our domain controller, on our file server, and on our Exchange server. Obviously, those are going to be some pretty important elements of our network, so we'll want to prioritize those, make sure that we understand exactly what our remediation steps look like, how long it's going to take, and what kind of resources we're going to need. We can also stop a lot of this by looking at attack paths ahead of time. And this is one of the features that we're going to showcase here in Tenable right as we end out the webinar. This is their attack path mapping system. So what Tenable can do is work through your network and identify different pathways between different hosts that an attacker may or may not take. Here's one of the examples of it. So this is us starting over on the far side in our Commando server. This is our command and control hub. And it's telling us what we can do. What services can we access? What kind of potential malicious activity could we undertake just with that access? And then where can we go based on that? Here's another example of it. So this is us going from our regular foothold server all the way up to the domain controller using another software vulnerability. And here's how Tenable says this could go. We have our regular foothold, which we could then use to what's called sniff the network. What we're doing here is basically identifying what's what and who's who. We want to be able to find the domain controller, which we can do just by looking at network traffic in a lot of cases. Next, we're going to find a vulnerability in that domain controller, which we can scan for using other tools. An attacker could use something like a vuln scanner against you in this case. And using that vulnerability, we've now made it all the way into the domain controller. So we've gone from nothing all the way up to, well, basically having the entire network at our fingertips. All right, so again, we want to make sure people understand here. It's not usually single vulnerabilities. This is a cascading series of failures that we're going to run into. We have unpatched software, weak passwords, misconfigurations, compromised credentials, overly permissive user accounts. there's a lot more that we need to be keeping in mind. That's why we want to understand these problems. We want to integrate them into our plans, and we want to, again, make sure we have a cybersecurity program that addresses these. A lot of the stuff can be covered in our top security controls of 2024. The ones we covered specifically today: data and asset inventory, scanning and vulnerability management, penetration testing, supplier risk management, and incident response testing and training. Including these as high-level elements to increase in your program, again, can be very beneficial and can save you a ton of time and hassle in the long run.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me at info@lmgsecurity.com, find me on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.